The late afternoon light filtered through the windshield, painting faint gold across the dashboard of David Ellis's car. 64 years old, pressed shirt, leather briefcase on the passenger seat. He was on his way home from a probate hearing in Greystone County, Alabama. A former city prosecutor turned private attorney, David kept things simple. No missed court dates, no raised voices, just quiet routines, steady hours, and a deep respect for the law. But flashing lights in the rearview mirror changed everything. The cruiser didn't blare its siren. Just the lights. Enough to catch attention. Enough to stir unease. David pulled over without hesitation, parking along a 2-lane service road. The officer didn't approach right away. Minutes passed. Then finally, the door opened, and boots hit gravel. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," came the voice. Flat, stern, no greeting. David nodded, polite. "Sure, I have them right here." His fingers moved through his glove box, slow, deliberate. He handed over each item one by one. The officer barely glanced at them. "You know why I stopped you? I believe it said 76 in a 55. "You believe or you know?" David hesitated. "I wasn't trying to argue, just answering as clearly as I can." No reply. The officer turned, walked back to his car, and sat for nearly 5 more minutes. Then came the shift. The officer returned and tapped the side of the window. "Step out of the vehicle." "Is there an issue?" David asked. "I said step out, now." David unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the gravel. "We're going to do some quick checks," the officer said, already circling. "Put your hands where I can see them." David complied. "You got anything I should know about? Weapons? Substances?" "No, sir." "What about that brown bottle I saw near your seat?" David blinked. "I don't drink, officer." "Right." The officer gestured toward the front of the patrol car. "Walk over there, face my headlights." David did. Quiet, cautious. A breathalyzer was pulled from the cruiser. "Ever used one of these before?" "Not this kind." The officer explained the steps, but before David could respond, the questions turned sharp again. "Tell me something," the officer asked. "Why did you lie about what's under your seat?" "I didn't lie," David said, calm but firm. "There was no bottle. You're telling me I imagined it? I'm telling you what I know." That's when the hands moved fast. "Turn around," the officer barked. "Put your hands behind your back." David lifted his arms slowly. "Look, there's no need for cuffs. I'll cooperate. I'll do the test. You're done talking." And just like that, the grip clamped down. Fingers at his wrist. Pressure behind his elbow. David was spun, shoved, thrown face first to the ground. His chest hit pavement. Gravel scraped his cheek. A shock of pain lit up the side of his face. He gasped, confused. "What are you doing?" "I'm not resisting." The officer didn't answer. He pressed his weight down harder, pushing David's arm unnaturally behind his back. "Please," David wheezed. "You're hurting me." Boots scuffed. Radio static buzzed. Backup was called. "You bloody my face," David muttered, voice cracking. Why are you doing this?" No response. Just metal cuffs locking in place and more force where none was needed. By the time the second unit arrived, David Ellis was lying on the ground, bleeding, dazed, cuffed, and whispering the same words over and over. "Tell me this isn't real." The pavement was hot beneath David Ellis's cheek. Dust and grit pressed into his skin. Somewhere in the haze, he heard a radio call crackle, then footsteps. "Stay down," Officer Travis Bannon growled, his knee shifting weight into David's spine. "I'm not moving," David gasped, voice strained. "Quit shifting. I'm not—" Another boot approached. "He got a back seat?" "Nope," Bannon muttered. "Just let him sit there for now." David stayed still. Not resisting. Just breathing. Just trying to stay conscious. "Where's the damn unit?" Bannon barked. "I need this guy loaded." He paced for a second, then dropped back down. "Roll to the side," he ordered. "Feet under. Sit up slow." But instead of helping, he hooked an arm around David's shoulder and shoved him back down. That's when the tow truck arrived. The driver, stocky, buzz-cut, stepped out cautiously. "Need help?" "Yeah," Bannon said, nodding. "Get his other arm." With no warning, David was flipped onto his stomach again. Gravel scraped his face. His shoulder tensed under unfamiliar hands. "I said I'd take the test," David coughed, barely audible. "I said it already." But the officer didn't respond. His forearm pressed into David's neck. Not a hold, not a move. A crush. David couldn't speak, couldn't lift his chest. The pressure didn't ease. Backup arrived seconds later. Officer Troy Daniels stepped out and didn't ask questions. He dropped a knee, directly onto David's upper back, weight heavy. Still cuffed. Still motionless. David saw sidewalk blur in his vision. He whispered something even he couldn't hear. By the time they stood him up, his shirt was ripped, one side of his face bloodied, his glasses cracked across the frame. Later that night, the official report was filed. In the arrest notes, Officer Bannon wrote that David had twisted away when being told to turn around, that he had pulled free, pushed away, resisted arrest, and needed compliance strikes to be subdued. He claimed David was non-cooperative, attempted to roll away, and that closed-hand strikes were necessary. There was no mention of the choke, no reference to the force used at the neck, no comment on the duration of pressure. Sergeant Connor Hale reviewed the use of force report. He signed off without question. He repeated Bannon's language. Subject showed active resistance, attempted to rise from the ground, required pressure to collarbone region to ensure control. In his summary, Hale wrote that the officer's hand had rested momentarily across the upper chest to allow for a radio call. Nothing more. No mention of backup placing a knee on the spine. No mention of the tow truck driver. No note of how David's nose had been bloodied. No admission of the video. And yet, one existed. The body cam that Bannon had finally turned on mid-stop was rolling. It captured the fall, the silence, the stillness, the weight. And in every frame, David Ellis is lying still, not fighting, not resisting, just surviving. David sat against the cruiser's back tire, blood drying across his cheekbone. His vision blurred in one eye, and the warmth from the pavement beneath him felt more like weight than heat. He wasn't moving. He couldn't. A second officer, stocky, stiff, stood nearby, arms crossed. "You got a back seat in that unit?" "Nope," Bannon answered flatly. "Just let him sit tight. EMS will check him out before we transport." David leaned his head back against the vehicle, dazed. "I'm not fighting, and I never was." No one listened. Bannon turned to the new arrival. "He's being charged with resisting, too. He's an attorney, by the way." The officer gave a dry chuckle. "Even better." They waited for a sergeant. Bannon pulled out a tow slip. "Let's get this car out of here." David heard fragments of voices, cold, procedural. A mention of booking, of strikes, of forms. One line landed like glass. "Yeah, we'll need an incident report. Closed-hand strikes, contact injuries. AIR him administrative incident report." It sounded like protocol. In truth, it was armor. When Sergeant Hale finally arrived, Bannon walked him through the story like a script already rehearsed. "He pulled away when I tried to cuff him. Moved toward the car. I redirected him. He spun. I had to go physical." "And the neck pressure?" Hale asked. "Minimal, brief. Just enough to call in backup." The sergeant nodded. No follow-up, no review of the footage. Just a cosign. Later that evening, Bannon filed his official version of the encounter. He wrote that David had tensed up when asked to comply, that he attempted to turn toward the vehicle and refused verbal commands. He included lines about compliance strikes, pressure tactics, and subject resistance. But what the report didn't say, what it deliberately left out, was that David had never raised his hands in defiance, never shouted, never shoved. It also made no mention of the forearm pressed into David's neck, or the moment Officer Daniels placed his knee onto David's back while he lay silent on the concrete. Sergeant Hale's review matched Bannon's report word for word. His summary included phrases like controlled hold, brief pressure to the upper chest, and necessary response to active resistance. In truth, the camera had caught it all. David had been down before the command to get on the ground was even uttered. His arms had been pinned when the order to give up his hands was barked. His silence had been treated like defiance. Greystone PD's own policy manual was clear. Chokeholds are not authorized unless deadly force is warranted. Once a subject is restrained, only the minimum force necessary is permitted. Every officer shall use sound judgment in assessing risk, compliance, and response. None of it had been followed. David Ellis wasn't a danger, he didn't pose a threat. But the paperwork now painted him as aggressive, evasive, and non-compliant. Words chosen carefully, force justified retroactively, and nowhere in the documents was the truth. The scene was quiet now. EMS hadn't arrived yet, but David was back against the car, wrists cuffed, face bleeding, and chest tight from the weight of silence. Sergeant Connor Hale finally stepped into view, clipboard under one arm, calm, like this was routine. "Cameras on?" he asked. "Yep," Bannon said. "Everything's rolling." "Good. Let's get the pictures. Car, suspect U2, before the light drops." David kept still. He wasn't speaking anymore. Not because he didn't want to, but because every word was turned sideways. "He's got cuts on the face, closed hand strikes. Couple knees, maybe," Bannon explained casually. "He says he's an attorney. I don't know him." Hale raised an eyebrow. "Lawyer, huh?" "Says so. He was hiding a bottle under the seat. Completely dry, though. Said he'd been drinking. Played games on the breath test. Eventually, I just told him he's under arrest. That's when he pulls away, tries to roll, won't give me his hands. Classic. A few hits. Might have caught the ground wrong. That's where the blood came from." They moved with purpose, snapping shots of David's face, the pavement, his car. "You want to go to the hospital?" Hale asked, finally directing a question toward David. David's voice came out flat. "I don't think so." "You should have just complied when asked. That would have made this easy." "I never resisted," David said quietly. "You weren't here," he added, looking at the sergeant. "You didn't see it." Hale waved the comment away. "I trust my officer, especially when he's sober and the other guy's not." "I'm not intoxicated," David said. "Want to bet?" Bannon snapped. "You said you drank. You said you weren't drunk, but that's not the same. One drink is enough. You're a lawyer, right? You tell me where the line is." David shook his head slowly. "The test will show it." "Oh, we're doing the test," Hale confirmed. "We're doing all of it." Later at the station, David blew into the breathalyzer. The number flashed on screen. 0.064, under the legal limit. A blood test was offered. David agreed. When the results returned, his BAC was still low. 0.067. No impairment, no threat, no resistance. Still, he was processed, fingerprinted, logged. During the intake, he told them again. His wrist ached, and his face throbbed from impact. The intake officer asked mechanically, "Do you feel you need emergency care?" "I don't think so," David replied. The man checked a box. Noted. Back in the report room, Hale was completing the final incident review. He echoed Bannon's version. Suspect tried to escape control, pulled free, resisted ground positioning. "Closed hand strikes delivered," he wrote. "Minimal force used to maintain control. Subject later admitted to alcohol consumption." He didn't include that David passed both tests. He didn't include that David never raised a hand. He didn't include that pressure had been applied to the neck without warning. Instead, the narrative was sealed. Compliant officer, difficult subject, justified response. Just another box checked. But the truth? It was stored quietly inside the body cam footage, frames that showed a calm man, assaulted and accused, his silence mistaken for guilt. And the law? It would now have to decide whether control justified violence, and whether false words could cover a bleeding face. David Ellis didn't return to work for nearly 6 weeks. A torn artery in his leg made walking unbearable. His face, bruised and dark around the eyes, looked like it belonged to someone who'd survived a fall from a moving vehicle. The official story said he resisted, but the body told another version. He'd been charged with multiple offenses: excessive speed, impaired driving, resisting law enforcement, and property damage. None of them fit what actually happened. On April 15th, a year after the night that changed everything, David filed a civil complaint in Greystone State Court. The case was quickly moved to the federal system by the city's legal team. For months, the civil process stalled. The prosecutor wouldn't drop the charges, and no trial date was set. Until February 1st, nearly 4 years after the incident, David accepted a single misdemeanor: speeding. Every other charge vanished. Only then was his civil lawsuit allowed to continue. By then, the department had already locked in its narrative. Sergeant Connor Hales submitted a force evaluation days after the arrest. He concluded that Officer Bannon's actions were necessary to control a non-compliant, intoxicated subject. His recommendation passed to Lieutenant Marcus Shaw, who agreed without edits. Shaw praised Bannon's decisive response to perceived threats and cited the body cam footage as proof of proper procedure. Neither mentioned the chokehold. Neither acknowledged David's injuries. Neither referenced the audio that captured him screaming for help while handcuffed. No one inside the department questioned it. But outside, pressure was growing. Following the controversial death of a young woman during a forced entry raid, Greystone PD faced growing scrutiny. Public protests sparked media attention. On April 26, 2021, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a formal inquiry into the department's practices. It wasn't aimed solely at one case. It was about patterns, about decades, about silence. The investigation lasted nearly 2 years. What it uncovered stretched far beyond one arrest. The DOJ's final report dropped in March 2023. It named names, listed failures, and directly referenced David's experience. The findings were blunt: force used without justification, warrantless searches conducted in violation of policy, neck holds applied to people already restrained, supervisors routinely failing to review violent incidents, reports crafted to favor officers, not truth. David's arrest appeared as a key example. The document described what the footage showed. The individual appeared confused, but non-violent. After he delayed taking a sobriety test, the officer forcibly took him to the ground and applied pressure to the neck. A second officer arrived and reinforced the restraint, despite the subject being restrained and motionless. The report included direct quotes from the footage. "You're hurting me. I'm already cuffed. Please stop." The DOJ stated clearly, at no point was this level of force warranted. And they didn't stop at the officers. They blamed the department's leadership, citing weak oversight, incomplete documentation, and a culture that discouraged accountability. In case after case, they found similar patterns: use of neck pressure where it wasn't allowed, vague or missing details in reports, and a lack of consequences. David Ellis's name now appeared not just in court filings, but in a federal review of a broken institution. But the truth didn't undo the damage. He still lived with the limp, still carried the scars. What the report gave him wasn't justice, it was confirmation. He hadn't imagined what happened, and now, neither could anyone else. By the time the federal report was made public, David Ellis had already returned to his life, quietly, cautiously, with fewer steps and deeper scars. He walked slower now. Not from age, but from what had been done to him and what had been taken. The Department of Justice's findings confirmed what David had been saying from the beginning: that the system hadn't just failed him, it had conspired to bury the truth. The report laid it out plainly. Supervisors signed off on force without question. Internal investigators ignored policy and relied on Google. Officers used restraint methods not approved by any manual. Neck pressure was applied in dozens of cases. With no accountability, David's case was one of the DOJ's clearest examples. They wrote that the officer not only placed him in a prohibited choke, but kept him pinned even after he was cuffed, injured, and crying out. The report went further. It called out Greystone PD's failure to correct officers who used dangerous tactics, its culture of misreporting, and its lack of independent oversight. A few months later, the city signed a court-enforced consent decree. A 259-page document filed in federal court forced the department to overhaul how it trains, supervises, and disciplines its officers. For the first time, Policies were reworded with clarity. The new rulebook spelled it out. No neck pressure unless deadly force is legally justified. No prolonged weight on someone's back or head. No restrained subject left face down. All hands-on incidents required full written and video review. But policy changes couldn't undo what had already been done. David's lawsuit moved forward, piece by piece. His attorneys requested depositions, footage, call logs, anything that would finally force the city to acknowledge the harm done. And while the court proceedings dragged, the footage kept circulating. Online, in forums, in news segments. People watched him gasp for air, heard him say, "Please stop." He became proof of what was broken. Still, David never made a speech, never went on television. When asked why he kept going, he said only, "If I had screamed, they'd say I was dangerous. If I had fought back, I'd be buried." Staying calm was the only weapon I had left. And it worked. Because the footage didn't just show a violent encounter. It showed a man who refused to break, even when the system tried to crush him. David wasn't looking for headlines. He wanted something else. Truth. And a reason for the next man, old, brown-skinned, quiet, to believe that the uniform wouldn't always win just because it could. By year's end, new recruits at Greystone's police academy were studying revised protocols. Force reviews required body cam footage from start to finish. But none of that would have happened if David Ellis hadn't stood his ground while lying flat on the ground. His body bent, but his story didn't. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't raise a fist. And yet, they crushed him. That's why the policy changed. Because the truth stayed still long enough to be captured, and loud enough to be heard.